right. Well, thanks very much, Maggie, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from Nebraska. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you here this morning. I'm a member of the Colorado Native Plant Society. I've been for a number of years, and so it's a pleasure to get to speak to this group today. So we'll just launch into to this talk. Before I get too far, I want to acknowledge, and Maggie already mentioned places where I've worked in the past, but this book wouldn't have been possible without having worked for three wonderful institutions that are dedicated to connecting people with plant life. The Dick Arboretum of the Plains in Heston, Kansas, north of Wichita, if you're familiar with that area. The Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, which is based at the university in Lincoln, and Lauriston Gardens in Omaha. So working for these institutions over the past 30 some years has allowed me to do a lot of the travel and poking around and just thinking that resulted in this book. So I do want to acknowledge these wonderful places that enabled me to travel the plains on business, in air quotes. So this is a map of the Missouri River watershed. And the Missouri River, as you're probably aware, is the third largest river on the planet in terms of watershed. And it's been called the master stream of the Great Plains. So if you look at this map, you recognize some of the names: the Yellowstone, the Cheyenne, the Platte. The river we're going to be talking about today is the Kaw or Kansas River, and it's located down here at the bottom of the watershed, the south end of the watershed. And so you can see it outlined here. A couple of things to note as we look at this map is that the Kaw is the last stream off the plains as the Missouri, the Big Muddy, makes this monumental swing from south to east at Kansas City. And also, the Kaw is the only major tributary of the Missouri that does not arise in the Rocky Mountains. It arises strictly on the plains. And both of those factors are important in our consideration of the country of the Kaw. So a watershed is an area of land where all flowing water converges on a single point. And this map depicts the watershed of the Kaw. And so you can see it includes part of Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. The Kaw River itself is formed by the junction of the Republican River and the Smoky Hill River at the town of Junction City, Kansas, appropriately named, near Manhattan, where Kansas State University is. So the Kaw River itself is only about 173 water miles, you might say, from that junction to where it joins the Missouri River at Kansas City. So it's a relatively short river in that form, but it has a big watershed, 61,000 square miles, less than the Platte watershed, but still a big watershed. Now, the name Kaw may be foreign to folks living in Colorado, and actually it is to people living in Nebraska. But if you lived in Kansas City or Lawrence or Topeka or Manhattan, that's a very familiar name for the river. Officially, formally, it's the Kansas River, but it's been called the Kaw since the 1830s. And so in the Kansas City area, you find everything from banks to dentist offices to exterminators to sand and gravel companies with the name Kaw in them. The Friends of the Kaw, we'll talk about them later on in the program, a conservation organization dedicated to preserving, protecting, advocating, and discovering the Kaw. So and the origin of the Kaw comes from the name of the indigenous peoples that dominated the lower reaches of this river when Euro-American explorers first kind of stumbled upon them in the 1700s. And Kaw is the preferred name of the Kansa people, who the Kaw Nation. But it's one of many different variations of this word that you had the French trappers who would first learn the name of a people or of a place, and they would put a name on a map, and then you would have the Euro-American folks that were trying to decipher what the French said, who were trying to decipher what the indigenous people said. But anyway, there's a lot of variations of the name Kansas, but Kaw is the preferred name of the Kansas people and is the name applied to the river. So the Kaw traverses several major physiographic regions. These are areas of land where the geography and topography and the geology and soils are all kind of consistent and create a unique vegetation. This map shows that the Kaw rises on the high plains and traverses through the Smoky Hills in Kansas, the Lusk Plain in Nebraska, and glaciated region in eastern Kansas, and the Flint Hills in Kansas. This map, shows it a little bit more clearly. This is a map of the physiographic regions of Kansas. And so if you think of the Kaw arising in eastern Colorado on the high plains and then coming across the high plains to the Smoky Hills, to the Flint Hills, and then it nicks a little bit of the Glacial Hills and the Osage Cuestas. So these are names of places I'll be referring to a little later on. So again, just to kind of help get a sense of place, find our way a bit, here are some of the major cities and towns located within the watershed of the Kaw. And these are ones that are mentioned in the book, but you can see in eastern Colorado where Denver is, and Akron's right on the cusp of the watershed, and Holyoke and Ray, Fox Ranch, Cope, Burlington, Cheyenne Wells, and some of these others. So gives you a feel for some of the communities that are within the watershed. Well, this book is really what's sometimes been called a deep map or maybe big history. It goes from geology and landforms through plants and animals and ecological systems to human communities and modern revitalization efforts in human communities. So it's going to be kind of a deep dive through all these subjects. And as I was pulling the book together over the years, the last few years, and thinking about it, it sort of fell into four sections: affection, astonishment, sorrow, and hope. And these are going to provide the framework for my talk with you this morning. And we're going to start with affection. And this deals with my connection to this particular landscape, how it's developed over the years and deepened over the years as well. So this map shows two very important landmarks within the watershed of the Kaw. You have Kaw Point, Kansas City, and this is where the Kaw River joins the Missouri River. And then at the far western edge of the watershed is Cedar Point. Cedar Point is located just a little north of the town of Lyman. If you've been across on Interstate 70 and look north, you can see Cedar Point as some high ground to the north of Lyman. So these two landmarks provide the bookends for the region, but they're also kind of the bookends of my experience with the region. So this is Kaw Point, and this is looking from the Kansas side of Kansas City to the Missouri side of Kansas City. And a lot of folks, again, in Nebraska and probably in Colorado as well, don't realize that there's a Kansas City, Missouri, and a Kansas City, Kansas. So we're standing on the Kansas side, looking across to the Missouri side. You can see that line there where the Kaw is beautifully merging into the Missouri River as it makes this big bend around and towards from Kansas City to St. Louis. And so I love this image. I think it's beautiful, and it clearly shows the skyline in Kansas City. And what I particularly like about it is it shows this building, this part of the skyline, which has a lot of meaning to me because my dad worked in that building in the 1960s and 70s. This is the Kansas City Power and Light Building, and a beautiful Art Deco structure built in the 1930s. And my family, Ed and Marianne Locklear, moved their kids, Jeff and Jim, my brother, I'll give him precedence here, from South Bend, Indiana to Kansas City in 1962. Now, I'm not sure, I love this old photo of the family. I'm not sure why my brother got to wear the bow tie, but he really was adorable. So I have to give him that. But so I grew up in Kansas City from the 60s through the 70s. And so that part of the watershed means a lot to me. Cedar Point, at the far other end, this is where the high plains surface drops away into the Colorado Piedmont, which eventually to the west rolls up into the foothills of the Rockies. Cedar Point is the farthest point away from Kaw Point. It's the far extreme western edge of the watershed of the Kaw, and its elevation is about 6,000 feet, so it's actually higher than Denver, and about the same elevation as Colorado Springs. So it truly is the high plains. And here you can see the surface sort of tumbling away in hills to the west and north. It's called Senior Point because it's populated along these sheltered north-facing canyons with Rocky Mountain juniper, cedar, and also ponderosa pine, about 70 miles away from the foothills of the Rockies. So you can see Pikes Peak from here, and you can kind of smell and hear the Rockies as the wind works through the cedars and the pines. This is, again, this is the headwaters of the Arickaree River, which is the westernmost tributary of the Kaw. So from one end to the other. Now, what got me out to Cedar Point and through a good part of eastern Colorado were botanical travels, doing research, primarily rare plant surveys for species that were considered at risk of extinction. So one of the plants that I've worked with a lot over the years is the dwarf milkweed, Asclepias uncialis, which is native to shortgrass prairie. It's a tiny plant. If you've ever seen it, it's hard to find. And so searching for this plant in eastern Colorado had me walking a lot of shortgrass prairie and walking it very slowly to try and find this plant. So that got me out into the high plains of eastern Colorado. Another plant that I've worked with from the region is sand sage prairie clover, Dahlia cylindriceps, which is pretty much restricted to sand sage prairie throughout the Great Plains. And again, that got me out west away from Heston and Lincoln and Kansas City. So botanical travels opened up my eyes to the western reaches of the country of the Kaw. But I've also over the years been involved with horticultural work and trying to find native plants with garden merit, horticultural merit, to bring these plants into cultivation today as water-wise plants, well adapted, native plants well adapted to dry landscapes. So these are two plants that I worked with both while I was at the Dick Arboretum of the Plains and the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, both named after John Charles Fremont, who discovered them in the Smoky Hills of Kansas in 1844. Fremont's evening primrose and Fremont's clematis, beautiful wildflowers, signature plants of the Smoky Hills that have actually were in the trade for a while and then have been brought back to the trade. And particularly Fremont's evening primrose, there's been quite a bit of work in Colorado to develop new cultivars. Lauren Springer Ogden has developed cultivar, I think it's called Shimmer, of Fremont's evening primrose. It's become very popular in the trade. So in addition to botanical travels, there was horticultural travels. And these travels were directed, in a sense, from a distance by Claude Barr, who was a rancher in South Dakota and wrote this wonderful book called Jewels of the Plains. And Claude he homesteaded in South Dakota in the early 1900s near the Black Hills. And long story short, developed a native plant nursery, a mail order native plant nursery from this little corner of South Dakota. And after about 70 years, wrote a book about his experience with these plants of the plains. And so this book has been kind of a benchmark for me in a lot of ways in doing horticultural work and trying to track down some of the plants that Claude wrote about that had actually had in the trade through his business, and then since had fallen away. So that Claude helped get me out to the Western Plains as well. And just a little shameless plug here, the original version of Jewels of the Plains is out of print, but I worked with the University of Minnesota Press to bring it back into print in 2015, and you can still buy it there. And all I did was update the botanical nomenclature. His original writing, which is just wonderful, is still in the book. And so I would commend it to you if you're interested in the flora of the Great Plains and its horticultural attributes. So those kinds of travels helped me to discover places I had no idea existed, like the Arickaree Breaks out in the northwest corner of Kansas, remote, isolated, in pristine condition, just gloriously beautiful. And a similar sort of habitat occurs just across the line in Colorado and Nebraska as well. So I discovered and got to see some beautiful country that just kind of really captured my heart. That was professional work, but also I drug my family along on a lot of these travels. When we lived in Heston at the Dick Arboretum of the Plains, we lived pretty close to the Flint Hills, and so we'd make some travels over there. This was a day we had a picnic on near Cassaday in the Flint Hills of Kansas. Really one of the highest points in the Flint Hills, beautiful area, not very far from where Zebulon Pike marched and in his expedition in 1806 and described in his journal that he passed very rough Flint Hills. So that's the origin of the name for the Flint Hills. And these are our kids, and this is in the 90s, early 90s, Kendra, Karen, and Greg. And the girls are wearing Little House on the Prairie dresses that my wife Lynn sewed for them. So this picture has a lot of meaning for me. And again, just another deep and affectionate connection to the land. So that's just a little bit about my connection to this region that we're talking about today. Next, we're going to go into the subject of astonishment. And as I worked on the book and started kind of going over my field notes and thinking about things I'd seen and people I'd talked to and experiences I'd had, astonishment really is the word that I'd have to use. Just the biodiversity, the human history, the wonderful places. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about astonishment. In fact, actually, I wanted the subtitle to be In the Country of the Kaw, Astonishments from the Heart of the Plains, but I didn't get that past the publisher. But I hope you'll get a sense of that as we wade into this a little bit. So you may not be aware, but some of the world's largest things occur in the country of the Kaw. For instance, in Nebraska, we have the largest covered porch swing, town of Hebron. Along I-70, you'll find the world's largest prairie dog, which is actually fiberglass, and they don't let you see it from the interstate, so you have to get off, pay a fee to see it, but it's there, or it used to be. I don't know, it may not still be there. The world's largest Czech egg. I have no idea what the significance of that is in the town of Wilson, Kansas, a Czech community. And probably most famously, the world's largest ball of twine in Cawker City, Kansas. So these are some of the astonishing things that you will find in the country of the Kaw. But the town of Lucas, Kansas, in the Smoky Hills, the north central part of Kansas, takes this to a whole nother level. If you go there, it's a town of just a few hundred people. You will find the world's largest souvenir travel plate. But my favorite is you'll find the world's largest collection of the world's smallest versions of the world's largest things. So there's Lucas is a place where folks who practice grassroots or outsider art have settled or opened studios, and it just has a very humorous vibe to it, kind of tongue in cheek. But nonetheless, some of the world's largest things are there. Here in Nebraska, we have the world's largest mammoth skeleton the largest mammoth skeleton on display in the world is at the University of Nebraska State Museum. So there's the skeleton right there, and that is called Archie, nicknamed Archie after his scientific name, is the mascot of the museum. And there's a huge sculpture, life-size, outside the museum. That's my granddaughter, 6-year-old Millie, standing there, just to give you a little bit of perspective. So and some spectacular and actually very important fossil finds have come from the country of the Kaw over the years. Lilacs are kind of iconic plants of the Great Plains. They're not native, but they were planted widely by settlers because they're extremely hardy and beautiful and carried a sense of back home, back east from gardens, maybe back in Missouri or Virginia or wherever they came from. And one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest collection of lilacs is found on a wheat farm in south of the town of Ogallala, Nebraska, on the High Plains, the very far edge of the watershed of the Kaw. And it's a wheat farm owned by Max Peterson, calls it Meadowlark Hill Lilac Farm. And it's about 4 acres of lilacs tucked in within about 1,000 acres of wheat on this High Plains tableland. I went there. I've been there a couple of times. I went there in the 90s with my son, Greg, who was 10 at the time. There he is standing next to Max. And as we were touring around the lilacs, it was May, the lilacs were in full bloom. And I asked Max what was his favorite, which is probably a dangerous question. But anyway, he said his favorite of all of them was this one called Beauty of Moscow. There's a huge lilac. They're standing in front of it there, probably 12 feet tall and extremely floriferous and very fragrant. And it was this lilac was developed by a lilac breeder from Russia, Leonid Kolesnikov. And this lilac has been so beloved around the world that it won him the Stalin Prize in 1951, an award that usually goes to physicists and astronomers and poets and architects. So anyway, there's a lot of great stories about lilacs. In fact, there's one in the book got some experiences with lilacs, but the world's largest lilac collection, or one of anyway, is in the country of the Kaw. Well, I could go on. There's other kind of quirky things, but we're gonna think more about the Kaw in terms of its environment and its ecology. And one thing that is very clear, if you look at the map, is that you can't get much more in the middle of the country, in some ways the middle of the continent, than the watershed of the Kaw. And Kansas City has long latched onto this as a branding, the heart of America, America's heartland. And so, and that's been going on for years and years and continues yet today. But in fact, the real heart of America is out in the middle of the watershed in the Smoky Hills. And it's 1 mile north and 1 mile west of the town of Lebanon, Kansas. And if you go there, you will find the U.S. Center Chapel, which is it's about the size of a tool shed with a steeple on it. Inside there are 8 pews and a little podium, and there's some inspirational literature. The door is never locked. It's always open. People can stop in at any time. And so this marks the very center of the lower 48. Before Alaska and Hawaii were added to the Union, they thought it marked the center of the entire United States, so they had to scramble a bit. Now it's a geographical center of the lower 48. So that's an important landmark. It's so important that Bruce Springsteen drove his Jeep out there. I don't know if you remember this commercial during the Super Bowl in 2021, but it featured Bruce visiting the U.S. Center Chapel in the wintertime, driving out there in his Jeep. And you remember 2020? Let's see, we had COVID, we had racial unrest, we'd had very contentious political elections, and Bruce rode out there, and the gist of the commercial was, "We need the middle. America needs the middle." And so the U.S. Center Chapel stood as kind of the landmark for that commercial. You can still see it on YouTube. It's very very compelling. Not too far from the U.S. Center Chapel is this cabin where reportedly the words to the song "Home on the Range" were written. And I have had audiences sing this song with me. We can't do it here today in a virtual sort of setting, but you're familiar with it. Home on the range where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word and the skies are not cloudy all day. And I think this is appropriate because I have decided that to declare the Kaw to be America's prairie river. And I think you'll see that as we go a little further into this talk. But it really is the river of the range, and it's appropriate that Home on the Range was written within its embrace. As we said before, the Kaw is the only major tributary of the Missouri River to arise solely on the plains and not in the mountains. And of those rivers, it's the only one to traverse all 3 of the major types of grassland in the central grassland of North America: tall grass, mixed grass, and short grass prairie. This map of Kansas shows it a little bit more clearly. So you have tall grass prairie in the east, where the Flint Hills are, and the Osage Cuestas and the glaciated region. Mixed grass prairie primarily in the Smoky Hills region, and then short grass prairie on the high plains extending into Colorado as well. So we're going to take a quick scan through a little travel across these communities. We're going to start in Colorado and roll downhill. Start with shortgrass prairie. This is another scene near Cedar Point. Shortgrass prairie is dominated by short grasses. So buffalo grass and blue grama, which in a good year might get a foot tall, but can be much shorter. And those are the dominant grasses of the shortgrass prairie. Mixed grass prairie, such as you would see in this scene in the Smoky Hills, is primarily dominated by little bluestem, which is a bunch grass, maybe gets 3 feet tall, a little taller in some conditions. And it occurs here in this beautiful limestone area. Those are post rocks, which are used extensively through this region. They were quarried from the surfacing limestone, and the bedding plane worked out perfectly for making these posts, particularly in a land where there was little timber. So post rock, it really is a signature feature of this landscape. It's kind of a cultural landscape as well. So that's mixed grass prairie, and it has elements of, you'll find blue grama there, sometimes even buffalo grass, and you'll find grasses from the tall grass prairie too. So just as the name implies, it's a mixture of tall and short grasses. And then in the eastern part of the watershed, you have tallgrass prairie, like this beautiful scene from the Kanza Prairie Biological Station, south of Manhattan, Kansas. This is early spring when the grasses are just beginning to green up. And you can see the rolling ridge and slope topography of the cuestas. And this prairie here is dominated primarily by big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass, grasses which in some settings can get 6 or 8 feet tall. Some of the upper slopes would be more dominated by little blue stem. Now, those are the three major grasslands of the central part of this North America. But another type of grassland occurs in dune fields in the Great Plains, and that's sand sage prairie. And this map shows the black areas are dune fields, and those are entirely dominated by a unique type of grassland formation called sand sage prairie. The area that's circled there with the W is the Ray dune field, and an extensive kind of a mini sand sea. And there you will find a mixture of prairie grasses, western prairie grasses, along with sand sage, Artemisia filifolia, creates a shrub steppe kind of habitat. Each of these plant communities has its own distinctive suite of forbs, wildflowers, some of which are shared with adjacent plant communities, some of which are not. I won't name all of these just for the sake of time, but you can see these are shortgrass prairie wildflowers. And oftentimes, as the name implies, the stature is rather short. Here's some that would be emblematic of the mixed grass prairie. Again, a little taller typically than shortgrass prairie wildflowers. And then in the tallgrass prairie, you have some wildflowers that might get 5-6 feet tall. The showiest time in the tallgrass prairie is late May, early June, when the grasses haven't started to really grow, get put on a lot of height, and a lot of the prairie wildflowers are in bloom and in full glory. So here's some examples of that. And sand sage prairie has its own unique suite of wildflowers that are adapted to very sandy habitat. So you see a few of them here. Well, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of grassland research that's taken place within the watershed of the Kaw because of touching on these major plant communities, grassland communities. And so here's just a few of kind of the luminaries of grassland ecology from the region. Dr. John Weaver, who taught and did research at the University of Nebraska for many, many years and generated lots of students that have continued on in ecology. His specialty was tallgrass prairie, and he spent some time primarily in Nebraska, but also down into Kansas, into some of the tallgrass prairies there. Down in the far lower right-hand corner is Dr. Fred Albertson, who was at Fort Hays State University. He was a student of John Weaver, and he was an expert on the mixed grass prairie region of western Kansas in particular. Did some pioneering research there. Upper right, you have Dr. Homer Shantz, who worked for the USDA, and he did some really spectacular and very important research in the early 19 teens and 20s in shortgrass prairie and sand sage prairie in the northeast part of Colorado. His research studies are very important. And down at the lower left, you have Dr. Kelly Kincher, who's at the University of Kansas, and he brings a certain hipster vibe to grassland ecology, which is pretty cool. And he has identified guilds in tallgrass prairie and done a lot of work in that regard. Vegetation mapping. He's published 2 very important books on the medicinal and edible plants of the Great Plains. His edible plant book just came out in a new edition. So you have these and others who have done pioneering research in grassland ecology, which actually was pioneering research in ecology, period. Some of the first ecological studies in any kind of setting were done in the grasslands of the country of the Kaw. And as important as this work is to us yet today, what I really enjoy is that the fact that for a lot of people, for a lot of Euro-Americans, this area was the first place where they actually experienced prairie. This is a map showing the environs around Kansas City. I guess there's my cursors working there. So you can see Kaw Point. The Kansas City skyline that we looked at in Missouri is over here, and Kansas City, Kansas is over here. So you can see this sort of the topography around there. Independence, Missouri, and Westport, Missouri were very important jumping off places for the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, during the Colorado Gold Rush, where people would jump off riverboats, steamboats, come up the Missouri from St. Louis, and then embark west. And so they'd been traveling through wooded areas, but once they got to Kansas City, this is where they first kind of were immersed in the prairie. And I love this quote from Susan Shelby McLaughlin, who was departing from Independence on the Santa Fe Trail in 1846. And the journal just says, now the prairie life begins. And so you find a lot of really almost enraptured accounts of what the prairie, this would have been tallgrass prairie, looked like in these days. Here's just a couple. Charles Geyer and Friedrich, I'll never pronounce this, Wislenius, were both departing Kansas City area in the 1840s and were encountering the tallgrass prairie at its full glory in May. Geyer said, the beautiful undulating prairies of the lower Kansas stretching themselves as if endless along the horizon. It is a charming sight in the months of May and June to behold these prairies teeming with wildflowers. And then both these guys are Germans. Then Friedrich said, the prairie over which we traveled looked much more beautiful than I'd ever seen it. The grass had all the freshness of spring, and the whole plain was so covered with flowers that it resembled a vast carpet of green, interwoven with the most brilliant colors. So you need scientific descriptions of the prairies, but it's also nice to have these poetic descriptions of the prairie. And this is a scene near Olathe, Kansas, on the west side of the Kansas City metro area of a prairie remnant called Kill Creek Prairie. Well, we're fortunate that in 1883, a 10-year-old girl arrived in the town of Red Cloud, Nebraska, born and raised in Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. Her folks brought her here, and she started looking around at the place and the people and wrote two very important, beloved books on pioneer life, O Pioneers and My Antonia, Willa Cather. And here, the circle shows Red Cloud. This is where she lived for from age 10 to when she went away to the University of Nebraska, and wrote these. Her experiences there led to the writing of these wonderful books. Red Cloud today is home to the National Willa Cather Center, so you can go there and learn more about. And there's a lot of historic landmarks in the town. It's a beautiful little town to visit, but probably no one is quoted as much when people are trying to find a good quote about the grasslands than Willa Cather. And I'll just have two examples here. The first one, both of these are from My Antonia. I felt motion in the landscape, in the fresh, easy-blowing wind, and in the earth itself, as if the shaggy grass were sort of loose hide, and underneath it herds of buffalo were galloping. And then all those fall afternoons were the same, but I never got used to them. As far as the eye could see, the miles of copper red grasses were drenched in sunlight that was fiercer than at any time of day. The whole prairie was like a bush that burned with fire and was not consumed. Now, I've seen Willa quoted many times in preface to articles on grasslands, almost always articles dealing with tallgrass prairie, although I've even seen her quoted in an article on Florida grasslands. But in fact, she was writing very specifically, although she never mentions it by name, about mixed grass prairie dominated by little blue stem, shaggy grass, and it turns copper red in the fall. So even though her writings are celebrated by folks who love to learn about the prairies and the grasslands, her writing was really based very locally on the mixed grass prairie. Another writer that maybe you're familiar with is Hal Borland. Hal Borland was a prolific writer, nature writer, wrote a lot of wildlife stories. And what you may not be aware of is that he grew up in eastern Colorado. And in his 30-some books, two of them are memoirs, one written based on his homesteading experience, and the other one he was a little bit older, High, Wide, and Lonesome, and Country Editor's Boy. So here's the Kaw watershed, and you can see that little circle there marks the 1910 homestead of Mr. Borland. His family moved from southeast Nebraska to that area in 1910, south of Brush, not quite within the watershed of the Kaw, but just outside. And then 5 years later, his family moved to Flagler, which is on the South Fork of the Republican River. and his father had a printing business and a newspaper. And so that's where he lived. And so his memoirs are based on those experiences. Two great quotes from two of those memoirs that have some botanical overtones to them. High, Wide, and Lonesome, he talks about an experience on the prairie. And the hills turn greener every day, and in one little hollow, not 100 yards from the house, I found a patch of yellow violets, tiny golden violets that I picked and brought and carried to Mother. She said they were the prettiest flowers she'd seen since we left home. She put them in a motor glass and set them on the windowsill. That's a 10-year-old boy. And I can hear the mother's hearts melting out there in the audience at the thought of her son going out and gathering wildflowers from the prairie. It was Nuttall's violet, a plant of the shortgrass prairie, beautiful little spring blooming thing. The other quote comes from the country editor's boy when he's a teenager. And I'm not, for some reason, I'm kind of getting blocked on this. Oh, sorry. I'll read it as best I can. So the next day, I went out to Kit Carson Hill and sat on the grass for a little while, thinking about the darkness and the stars, and her saying, I won't remember their names, but tell me again. It seemed a long time ago, a long, long time. The first blossoms were just opening on Valvestrum Ocinium, Cowboy's Delight. What I love about this is here's a poor teenage guy dealing with heartache and romantic longing, thinking about this girl that gave him a kiss out on Kit Carson Hill. And then he's trying to distract himself by thinking about native plants and botanical nomenclature. So anyway, I'd recommend both those books to you to get a feel for his wonderful descriptions of life on and the landscape of the high grass plains, or short grass plains. Well, the country of the Kaw is not all prairie. It's not without its woodlands. This is Baldwin's Woods Preserve. It's owned by the University of Kansas, south of Lawrence, not too far from Kansas City, kind of on the west edge of Kansas City. And if you walked around these woodlands, if you're from the eastern United States, you'd see a lot of very familiar trees, a lot of trees that you would find in the Ozarks of Missouri, particularly oaks and hickories and ash and redbud, things like that. But as you head west from here, these woodlands begin to kind of diminish in terms of their diversity, the diversity of tree species. So in the Kansas City area, there are those woodlands have 12 different species of oaks that occur there. But as you head west up the tributaries of the Kaw, the Republican, and the Smoky Hill, eventually only one is going to be left, bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, beloved tree of the Great Plains. And even out on its western limits, they can get big and burly. Here's one near Guide Rock, Nebraska, in the central part of the state in the Republican watershed, and another near the town of Paradise, Kansas, in the Smoky Hill River watershed. So these are beloved trees where they do occur. Everybody loves oaks, and when they're the only oak you have, you love them a lot. Then there's this area in the southwest corner of Nebraska called Bur Oak Canyon, which is isolated by 100 or more miles from the nearest population of bur oak along the Republican River. You can see that little arrow pointing to the western edge of its distribution, the red county marking the location of this. It's just this mysterious population of about 300 bur oak that are tucked down below the high plain surface in this canyon. And it's just it's a place of kind of pilgrimage to people that are just crazy about oaks. The only tree that occurs throughout the watershed of the Kaw from east to west is the eastern cottonwood. So you see it framing this view of Kaw Point in Kansas City. And then down below, lower right, a grove of cottonwoods along the Arickaree River in the Fox Ranch Nature Conservancy Preserve in eastern Colorado. So it's a tree that has a huge distribution through the eastern and central part of the U.S. But believe it or not, the national champion, the biggest, not the world's largest, but well, I guess it is. It's since this is an American tree, the national champion occurs not too far from where I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, close to the town of Beatrice. And it is 88 feet tall and 108-foot spread. You can see this friend of mine, Roger, standing in the middle of it. It's a cluster of trunks. It has one base. And at some point in time, that the tree was wounded and put out these big trunks, which would be big trees even by themselves. But a forester that I contacted to get directions to find this tree said, and you'll have to excuse him, she's big and relatively old, but she's not too pretty, which he was absolutely right. But a remarkably big tree. Okay, well, all of this diversity of plant communities and ecosystems supports a diversity of wildlife, particularly birds. So if you consider that the Kaw links the eastern deciduous woodlands with the shortgrass prairie, you can understand that there's could be quite a bit of bird diversity across the watershed, which in fact there is about 400 species, 400, more than 400 in the avifauna. I don't know if you're familiar with Merrill Gilfillan. He was a writer, is a writer who lived for a long time in Boulder, wrote a wonderful book called Magpie Rising, and a number of other collections of essays and poetry about the Great Plains. And in his book, Chokecherry Places, he makes this comment: I'm happiest in places, I should probably say habitats, where both eastern and western kingbirds are present. And certainly that is the case in the country of the Kaw. You have birds with eastern affinities, western affinities, northern, southern, grassland, woodland coming together over the course of the watershed. Here's just a few examples. Excuse me for a second. So in the eastern part of the watershed, you have birds that would be associated with oak hickory woodlands, some of which are year-round residents, some of which are summer breeders. And then you have warblers, which are passing through. This is on the upper left is a palm warbler, which is a bird that spends the winters in the Caribbean, not a bad idea, but then passes through the country of the Kaw and the Midwest and the breeding habitat up in Canada. So tiny little birds, they're a fleeting presence in the country of the Kaw, but they're beautiful things. Then at the other end of the extreme, in the upper right, you have lark buntings, which are birds of the shortgrass prairie. They winter in Mexico and the southwestern U.S. and then come to the high plains in April and May. And they are true skylark. The males have this elaborate aerial display where they rise up from the ground and reach a certain height, and then they float back with their wings extended and float back slowly to the ground while they're singing. And lark buntings, as I'm sure you're aware, is a state bird of Colorado, which may seem kind of surprising when you think about all the spectacular birds you have in the mountains, like western tanagers and mountain bluebirds. But I think it's pretty cool that a bird from the plains is your state bird. And then they head back south to the southwest in the wintertime. Harris sparrows are big sparrows, actually North America's largest. They're kind of a specialty of the eastern plains, and they have breeding habitat up in Canada around Hudson Bay, and then they spend the winters in the Flint Hills and further east. So birds coming and going. You have all kinds of things that are residents, like cardinals and blue jays and chickadees. But then you have the ferruginous hawk, which is North America's largest raptor. It's endemic to the Great Plains, and it is a year-round resident of the Great Plains. So that's a lot of things in it makes it stand out in terms of the fauna, the bird fauna of the Great Plains. One of the best places to see ferruginous hawks anywhere in the plains is in the Badlands associated with the Smoky Hill River in west central Kansas. These are badlands carved in the Smoky Hill chalk of the Niobrara Formation. It's not too different from what you might see around Pueblo, where the Smoky Hill chalk has been, in Canyon City, where that's exposed. But these pinnacles and cliffs provide nesting sites for the ferruginous hawks, as well as the remote sort of terrain that they prefer. And nearby, lots of prairie dogs. So perfect habitat. So that's a beautiful place. And if you need to add ferruginous hawks to your life list, that's a place you probably should visit. But the most remarkable bird habitat, in my mind, within the watershed of the Kaw is a place called the Rainwater Basin, which is in south central Nebraska. I'll try and move the cursor over. You can see this part of the state. It's about 6,200 square miles of land. And this is what it basically looks like. It's basically farm ground. It's some of the best corn country in the Cornhusker state, as well as soybean fields. But scattered throughout this agricultural landscape are playa lakes, basins that hold water after spring rains, summer rains, snow melt. And so there are these temporary wetlands that occur throughout the area. And these wetlands are extremely important to shorebird migration. In fact, there's about 40 species of shorebirds that migrate through the rainwater basin in a given year. And here's an example of some that will forage in these shallow basins. They come through in the spring, April and May, and then back through in July and August on their way. These are not shorebirds, but these are seagulls. So we do have seagulls and terns that pass through this area. These are Franklin's gulls. And if you think you see a little blush of pink on the chest of these birds, the breast, these are birds that spend the winter on the Pacific coast of Chile and then migrate up into north central US and into Canada to breed. And so they're coming up here with a little bit of a flush of pink from a diet of Chilean seafood, much like flamingos have that pink color. So they're wonderful when they come rolling into the rainwater basin in big numbers, by the thousands sometimes, in April and May. Farmers used to call them, and still do, prairie doves, even though they're not doves, but they're just elegant, beautiful birds of the prairie. Well, some of the birds that pass through here have incredible migration stories, and the rainwater basin figures very prominently in their life histories. Buff-breasted sandpiper is a shorebird that nests in the Pampas grasslands of Argentina, and its breeding habitat is all the way up in the high Arctic on these islands and the very edge of the Arctic Sea. So they pass through here in spring, typically in May. And studies of this bird have shown that about 90% of the population, the total world population of buff-breasted sandpiper, spends some time in the rainwater basin, making it critically important stopover habitat for a bird that is itself a high conservation value, endangered. The most remarkable migration story of all involves this bird, the Hudsonian godwit, which is a bigger shorebird, not quite as big as the long-billed curlews that you might see in eastern Colorado, but still kind of a big, chunky bird. And it spends the winter on the very southern tip of South America, and then migrates all the way up to Hudson Bay to breed. That's incredible, just in that sense. But and then once the breeding season is over, they head back south across the Atlantic to the southern tip of South America. But it's the spring migration that is, to me, most amazing. So some of the birds that stop in our wetlands in the rainwater basin have traveled 6,000 miles nonstop. That's 7 days of travel without food, 7 days of flying without food, water, or rest, all the way from the southern tip of South America. And if you stop and think about that, that's one of the most extreme migration of any creature on the face of the earth. And it engages, well, 2 continents, a third of the Earth's landmass, 2 of its oceans. So just an incredible story. And so I can run out to the rainwater basin. It's about 45 minutes from my house here in Lincoln, and see Hudsonian godwits in May, and then just try and contemplate the crazy life history of this bird. So accordingly, the Humboldt Rainwater Basin has been labeled a landscape of hemispheric importance by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. So an example of how even a, I guess you might say, well-worn, maybe even abused landscape can still serve biodiversity anywhere in the world. The high plains in eastern Colorado in particular, and western Kansas, also has temporary wetlands, and maybe that are more familiar to folks, called playas again. I love this quote from Hal Borland in his first book, High, Wide, and Lonesome. He describes going out and crossing the shortgrass prairie in the spring and stumbling across, he and his father in the wagon, Playa Lake in its full glory. We came to a broad, shallow lake, melt from the winter snow, and drained from the spring rain that would shrink to a little mud hole in another month or two. It hardly looked like water, it was so clear. And underwater, grass was growing much greener than the flat all around it. Ducks were there swimming on the clear water, over the green grass, as though they were swimming in the air. So he's watching ducks swimming basically over buffalo grass. It was a beautiful experience here. All right, well, we're continuing to look at the biodiversity of this region. And if you're looking at this image right now, you might be thinking, well, that's a coral reef, a tropical coral reef, or maybe a fish tank with some tropical fish in it. But actually, this was taken in a stream in the Kansas Flint Hills, Illinois Creek, pristine water, and these are three fish: Carmen Shiner, the red rosy colored ones, Common Shiner are the big ones, and red-bellied dace with the black sides and the red bellies that occur in these pristine streams in the Kansas Flint Hills. Some of the best aquatic habitat left anywhere in the Great Plains are found in these areas where we have uh, riparian areas, streams, spring-fed, that occur within the context of tallgrass prairie. And so this is Kings Creek on the Konza Prairie Biological Station south of Manhattan, Kansas State University. And this stream is actually in the USGS Hydrologic Benchmark Network. It's the only stream to arise entirely in pristine tallgrass prairie, and it hosts these spectacular little minnows, some of which are only about 3 inches tall or 3 inches long. There's an event I've been to. It's called the Fish Wizards Tour, and it's in the Flint Hills. It's set on a stream in the Mill Creek watershed, and it's organized by some local folks and brings in stream biologists and fisheries experts that will seine spots in the river and then bring up these fishes for people to see and learn about, and helps them appreciate both the beauty of these fishes and the value of this aquatic habitat. So you can see the young ladies holding those green sunfish there. So a wonderful experience and surprising amount of biological diversity associated with these streams. Well, you can't talk about biodiversity in the plains and not talk about bison. And I make the claim in the book, and I'm standing by it, that the country of the Kaw was, at least for a time, the greatest bison country in all of bison country. And I base that on the one hand, on Euro-American accounts of unbelievable numbers of bison covering the face of the country. And you can see a couple of them there. I won't read them word for word, but covering the face of the country, blackening the face of the land. And that led Richard Irving Dodge in his book, Hunting Grounds of the Great Plains, or Great West, published in 1877, to declare the Republican country as the chosen home of the buffalo. And he defined that as the country between the watershed of the Platte and the watershed of the Arkansas River. So really the upper waters of the Kaw. The chosen home of the buffalo. Mari Sandoz in her book, The Buffalo Hunters, would say that the Republican herd was the greatest of all the buffalo herds. And you can get an idea of why that might be. So here's a map of Nebraska showing topographic features, and here is the Platte River Valley here, and a smooth and relatively level. Here's the Republican down here in the southwest corner of the state, and you can see how intricately dissected the landscape is, and it has to do with the loess soils and the geology of the region. But instead of just having fairly uniform vegetation across here, you have short grass prairie on the uplands, mixed grass prairie on the side slopes, and tall grass prairie down below, as well as riparian oak woodlands. So very diverse habitat. And to my mind, that's part of the reason why the bison were so abundant in the watershed of the Kaw. But aside from the accounts of Euro-American explorers and early settlers, we have the fact that about 20 historic tribes of historic indigenous peoples, lifeways and histories were intimately connected with the country of the Kaw. Here's a list of them, and particularly in the eastern part of the watershed, the Kanza people, the Kaw Nation, were predominant. And then in the middle part of the Kaw watershed, particularly in the Republican region, you had the Pawnee Nation, and then on the high plains you had the Cheyenne and Lakota that were very important, and their histories are intertwined deeply with this country. And as you can imagine, they had to fight bitterly over it against each other and also against the U.S. government. The Plains Wars of the 1850s and 1870s, there's numerous battle sites scattered throughout the country of the Kaw that are very important. Beecher Island is on the Rickery River south of Ray, eastern Colorado. Massacre Canyon is along the Republican in the southwest corner of Nebraska, and this commemorates a battle between the Lakota tribe, the Brule and Oglala band of the Lakota, who ambushed a hunting party of Pawnee and killed about 70 of them in this area here. So a lot of history, a lot of tragedy connected to the country of the Kaw and the indigenous peoples. But none is more tragic and more really unspeakable than the Sand Creek Massacre, which did not occur within the watershed of the Kaw, but its aftermath rippled through it. So you can see on this map, the lower left, the location of the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site is on Sand Creek, which is a tributary of the Arkansas River. And it happened in the pre-dawn hours of November 29th, 1864, when Colonel Chivington led about 675 cavalrymen into this village of Cheyenne and Arapaho folks who were camped what they thought was under a flag of truce, under a flag of peace. So they were assuming they were safe. They were also men, women, and children camping or trying to spend the winter there in what they thought was a safe haven. And in the end, about 230 of the Indians folks were massacred. Most of them women, children, and elderly. And as terrible as that event was, the aftermath was also terrible. The survivors of Sand Creek Massacre made their way north to escape the soldiers, and their travels brought them into the watershed of the Kaw. This is a map that was drawn by George Bent, who was the mixed blood son of William Bent of Bent's Fort fame on the Arkansas River. His mother was Cheyenne. He was in the camp at Sand Creek when it was attacked, and so we have an account of the aftermath. They fled north over the open plains about 50 miles, traveling in the dead of winter. Most of them had been roused out of their teepees with very little clothing. Certainly, they didn't have their blankets. They didn't have hunting equipment, and many of them were wounded. And he talks about the escape and the trek north, and at night being so cold. It was open plains, no cover. They actually had to pull handfuls of grass up and cover people who were wounded and freezing. They made their way to a place called Bunch of Timbers Creek, which is actually the headwaters of the Smoky Hill River, and a place where big groves of cottonwood trees existed. And this was the favored camping ground of the Dog Soldier Band of the Cheyenne people. And they had protection there, and they began to come to grips with what had happened to them. Their wounds were treated, and they were fed and warmed, those that did survive. And then from that point on, warriors, particularly with the Dog Soldier Band, began to plan revenge. They moved north to a place called Cherry Creek, which is in the very northwest corner of Kansas. I'm sorry, here's the first camp after Sand Creek, and then Cherry Creek, where they gathered and plotted the revenge, which the first event was an attack on Julesburg, Colorado. So the country of the Kaw is intimately interwoven into the histories of many, many Plains tribes, very important from that standpoint. Even before the historical period, this region was host to massive herds of wildlife and very important to prehistoric peoples. And one of the most important archaeological sites in all of the Great Plains is the Jones Miller site, south of Ray, Colorado, in the northeast corner of the state, where a archaeologist found about 300 bison, bones of about 300 bison that had been slaughtered either for one massive kill or a series of kills over a couple of years by people that are known to be with the Hell Gap complex about 10,000 years before present. So you can see the bison bone bed here that was being excavated and some of the bones. This archaeological site was excavated by Dr. Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution, and he spent a couple of summers here doing that. And I love this picture that I got from the Ray Museum in the town of Ray. And so this is Dennis Stanford, world-renowned Paleo-Indian archaeologist, sitting on the 1970s shag carpet with the Jones family, Robert and Janie Jones and their son Mark. And you can see on the floor, you've got some of those artifacts, those spear points that were found mingled in with the bones in the Jones Miller site. And here's an image. These are now held by the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. They were held by the Smithsonian for a while. But there are about 100 some stone artifacts that were found within, spear points primarily found within the bone bed. And what amazed me as I learned more about this is that these were manufactured from about 5 different types of identifiable tool stone that were manufactured from known quarries within the Great Plains. So here's just 2 examples, actually the most far-flung examples. There were spear points made from Hartville Chert, from the Spanish diggings area in Wyoming, and from Alavetes Agricultural Chert down in the Canadian River Valley, not too far from Amarillo, Texas, 600 miles apart. So part of the mystery of these Paleo-Indian times is, what were these folks doing, traveling such huge distances on foot throughout the Great Plains, visiting these very esteemed quarries and bringing their stone here to the Arickaree Valley. This is the burial site of the Jones family, looking off into the Arickaree in the distance. This area really has been important, very important to archaeological work and anthropological work over the years. And believe it or not, during the Dust Bowl days, preceding and after, there was so much wind erosion in this area that it exposed blowouts, and a lot of artifacts came to the surface because of all the wind erosion that blew the soil, covering soil. And there is a wonderful collection that was made in Yuma County by the Anderson family, and somehow this has ended up at the University of Nebraska. I'm not sure why, but here's some examples of some of those spear points that were found. Dr. Douglas Bamforth at the University of Colorado has studied these from this region and throughout the Great Plains, and he's remarked that these points are always more beautiful and technically sophisticated than they needed to be for their utilitarian purpose, which was basically just to put food on the table. And he even went so far as to say that they are gratuitously elegant, meaning that something in the mind and heart of the stoneworker led them to create an object of beauty, kind of this human universal impulse to create beauty, and beauty that would be recognized by us 10,000 years later. So I just find that a remarkable part of the Kaw story, the country of the Kaw. Well, while we're talking about the connection between rocks and beauty and human culture, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at architecture, particularly in the Flint Hills and Smoky Hills of Kansas. William Least Heatmoon wrote this very important book, Prairie Earth, that was published in 1991. And he purposely went to the Flint Hills to write about a landscape that he thought nobody really knew about or cared about. And he was, of course, drawn by the vast expanses of prairie that was available to him. But he also says that after the thrall of the grassland itself, the thing that lured me here was the stone architecture, the adroitly laid rocks of the courthouse, the Cedar Point Mill, the bridges, banks, homes, fences, cattle chutes. And to the left is Chase County Courthouse, which he just fell in love with, which was built from locally quarried cottonwood limestone. In fact, the limestone was quarried on the hill where the courthouse now stands. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time touring around and looking at some of these beautiful places that were built of native stone. So that, again, this connection between geology and human culture. So in the Flint Hills, you have the Clay County Courthouse, built of cottonwood limestone, locally quarried. The Geary County Courthouse, Junction City, built of Fort Riley limestone. The Smoky Hills, where fence post limestone is very prominent as surfacing rock. You have the Lincoln County Courthouse and Osborne County Courthouse, and you can see distinctive way the stone lies and its color and different patterns of its lithology. And even on the high plains, the Ogallala Formation, which you don't often think of being suitable for stonework, was used. And so you have the Bird City Hall in Bird City, Kansas, Township Hall in Bogue, Kansas, and City Hall in Colby, Kansas. These 3 buildings were built by the Works Progress Administration, a Depression era program that particularly was focused on the Great Plains. So what would happen in these towns is that local guys would be hired, men almost entirely, would be hired to help build these buildings with federal funds. And they relied on locally available stone because that would keep the cost down. And so they're important not only architecturally, but also historically. So oftentimes you'll find a plaque like you see in the lower right-hand corner, erected by the Works Progress Administration. So these buildings are not as showy and as grandiose maybe as some of the courthouses, but to me, in some ways, they're almost more heroic. You find the same sort of thing if you look at churches through the region. So Holy Name Catholic Church in the Rosedale neighborhood, Kansas City, Kansas. You have this beautiful church built of locally quarried Argentine limestone, all the way out to southwest Nebraska, the Stone Church, and that's what it's called in Hitchcock County, built of the Ogallala Formation. But if you're looking for a road trip, head to Hays, Kansas, and you're interested in architecture, head to Hays, Kansas, and you will find a circle of about 8 towns that have, each of them has these beautiful Roman Catholic churches. Some of them are gigantic, that were built by German immigrants kind of in the early 1900s, 1910s, 20s. Biggest of these is the Basilica of St. Francis, which is called the Cathedral of Plains. You can clearly see it from Interstate 70 as you're driving by. I think it was built in 1911. And when it was built, it was the largest church west of the Mississippi. And as you can see from those numbers, a lot of these churches occur in tiny towns. In fact, this Gothic beauty in Pfeiffer, Kansas doesn't even have a population that registers with it's an unincorporated town now. So spectacular, interesting architecture. All right. All connected to geology. We're going to take one last look at the connection between rocks and human culture, and then we'll take a break here in just a moment. There's a region in Kansas, and it extends up into Nebraska, called the Glacial Hills. And this represents the furthest extent of glaciation that occurred in North America. And so you can see the Continental Glacier up here, and this little dotted line, and that it reflects this line right here. And as the glacier moved south, it ground over the landscape, it would pick up rock and haul it along, and then eventually at the glacial boundaries drop that rock. And so we have what are called glacial erratics, which are maybe have been moved 300 miles or more from the bedrock source. And so you find that in the country of the Kaw and certain hilltops, where you will find a sea of rocks, a Felsensmeer, which actually is a term of alpine ecology and Arctic ecology that reflects some of the rock formations in alpine areas. But these big fields just covered with these Sioux quartzite boulders, which is pink and a very different stone from any of the native stone. And even if you don't find one of these Felsensmeers, if you drive around in towns in the area, you will find these stones incorporated into the architecture of all kinds of places. So in Wamego, Kansas, City Park, home to the annual Tulip Festival, you have this beautiful fountain and bandstand that's just made out of glacial erratics. But my favorite is here in Nebraska. This is the Boy Scout cabin in McNish Park in Fairbury, Nebraska. You can see built of the stone. This was a building that was built again with WPA labor, although to me it looks like there were some elves involved in the process. But the most spectacular glacial erratic to be found in the country of the Kaw is the Shunganunga boulder, which is a fun word to say, that historically occurred at the junction of Shunganunga Creek with the Kaw River near the city of Topeka. And it was there for years and years, and folks were aware of it. And the city of Lawrence decided that they wanted this boulder, and they were going to use it as a marker to celebrate the founding of the town of Lawrence. So in 1929, they sent a crane out and extracted this thing from the ground, hauled it to Lawrence, and set it up in what's called Robinson Park. So there you see a historic picture. Here's a more recent picture with my wife Lynn, to give you a little bit of a scale. And so it was, and the people in Topeka had been planning to move the boulder eventually to the state capitol grounds, and so they were not happy about this. So it created quite a bit of hubbub. But all of that aside, this stone was sacred to the Kaw Nation, the Kansa people. And so it was taken from them. It was a place of pilgrimage and religious ritual for them. But in 2022, I believe, the Kaw Nation petitioned the City Council of Lawrence to return the boulder to the Kaw Nation. And guess what? They did. And the boulder was moved to land owned by the Kaw Nation near Council Grove, Kansas. And it was moved to their Alaguaho Heritage Park. I'll try and pronounce this name. We call it, we would think of it as the Sacred Red Rock, but it's Injiwa Wahobe. It's the name of this rock, and here you see it and location in the park in the Flint Hills. And before is a family of father and sons from the Kaw Nation. So I just think it's a beautiful story. Way to go, Lawrence. That's kind of a cool thing. So at this point, Maggie, I think we'll take a break and then we'll move on into the rest of the talk. So um, if you're there, does that sound okay?
Yes, Jim, that sounds great. We will just pause the recording and how long do you want to break for? It's 10:15.
10 minutes, maybe?
Sure, so we'll get started again at 10:25.
All right, great.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Glad to see everyone here. If you have any questions, I forgot to mention this before, please write them in the chat, and then at the end, we will have an open discussion to address any of your questions. Does that sound good, Jim?
Sounds great.
All right, well, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. All right. Well, we're going to move from this happy note to um, the third part of the structure of the book, and titled Sorrow. And uh, the country of the Kaw really is an astonishing place in terms of its biodiversity and cultural history. But there have been some things that have happened within this watershed that really environmental degradation of kind of staggering magnitude. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at those and talking about them. Pardon me, both because it's part of the history, but also if we're going to, inform how we use the place and manage the place, we kind of need to know this history and maybe recognize some patterns. So now we're going to be wading into the part of the talk called sorrow. And again, you can't talk about this part of the world without talking about bison, and particularly about the destruction of bison in the Great Plains. The image on the left is titled "Slaughter of the Buffalo on the Kansas Pacific Railroad," and it appeared in the book that I mentioned earlier, "Hunting Grounds of the Great West" by Richard Irving Dodge, 1877. Part of the reason that bison were exterminated, or in a sense so easily exterminated in this part of the world, is because the railroads were reaching out into it, and so there was a way to haul the products, basically bison robes, back to the eastern markets. Ironically, this image, which was published in 1877, was reprinted in a book called or a paper called "Extermination of the American Bison" by William Hornaday, which is credited with actually saving the bison from extinction, his publication. And so maybe in some small way, the country of the Kaw played a role not only in the destruction, wholesale slaughter of the bison, but also in saving it from extinction through this image. But the wonderful book, American Serengeti by Dan Flores, if you have a chance to take a look at that, talks about all the last big animals of the Great Plains. Of course, speaks a lot about this chapter in our history. He called the whole thing the largest wholesale destruction of animal life discoverable in modern history. And that happened within the watershed of the Kaw. So it's an astounding thing. It's almost beyond comprehension that millions upon millions of animals could be eliminated from the face of the land. But something that developed as a side hustle to bison hunting was wolfing, sometimes called wolf hunting, but really it's probably wolfing was more precise a term for it. James R. Mead was a man who he fancied himself a hunter. He was one of the bison hunters back in the 60s and 1860s and 1870s, even a little earlier than that, primarily focused on the Smoky Hill region. And he wrote a book. Well, a book was compiled from his notes and journals called Hunting and Trading on the Great Plains. And in that book, there's an account of the practice of wolfing. And I'll let you read what's written there. I won't read that verbatim, but basically the idea was this, that they discovered that when they would shoot bison and the bison carcasses were laid around, that wolves would come and feed on them. So they devised a plan where they would tuck strychnine baits into the the carcasses of the bison, the wolves would come and eat those baits, and then the wolves themselves would die without the hunters, in quotes, actually having to hunt them. And then they could skin the wolf carcasses and get their pelts, which were becoming very valuable, particularly in Europe. Excuse me. So, but this spiraled kind of beyond imagination. So you have bison dead on the prairie, their carcasses, the wolves were feeding on them, they were dead on the prairie. And then ravens and other birds would come in and feed on the bison or on the wolves, and they would be dead on the prairie. And so in this account, he says, speaking of the ravens, this would kill them, feeding on the poisoned wolves. And the prairie about the carcasses would soon be dotted with the glossy, shining bodies of defunct ravens, with an occasional bald eagle among them. Now, as horrible as this is, it's ironic because when Meade first came into this area where he set up his hunting camp, he made this comment, "Boys, we have got into paradise at last," because he saw a landscape that was covered with bison and with wolves and elk and antelope and beaver in the rivers and otter, turkeys everywhere. He called it God's great park. But by the time he was done with it, you had carcasses everywhere. It must have been a hellscape when you think about it. So this destruction of animal life is just unbelievable, and as Flores says, just unprecedented in the historical record. So bison did survive, and thankfully, bison herds are growing in many parts throughout the Great Plains. But human beings did succeed in exterminating and bringing some creatures into extinction. One of these being Eskimo curlew. The Eskimo curlew had the same kind of a migration pattern as our Hudsonian godwits, all the way from South America up into the high Arctic, passed through the rainwater basin in spring, and then in the fall or late summer, early fall would migrate south along the Atlantic coast. The problem is these birds they'd land in huge numbers. There's one account of them landing in the rainwater basin in flocks that covered 30 acres of ground. They're highly gregarious and relatively tame. And so, at least here in Nebraska, when word got out that they had landed, hunters from Omaha would go out, market hunters, and just slaughter them by the wagon load. And if there were enough of them, if they filled up a wagon and they wanted to get some fresh birds, they'd just dump them out and shoot and reload. Professor Myron Swink at the University of Nebraska wrote an article in 1915 called "The Eskimo Curlew and Its Disappearance." And he said this, "In this deadly work, the people of Nebraska, to our lasting discredit, played a conspicuous and all too effective part." So the destruction of animal life in the country of the Kaw was a tragedy, unspeakable tragedy. This is the earliest image of the Kaw that I could come across. It was a painting by Alfred Jacob Miller, and it was painted in 1858. It's housed at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. It's based on a expedition he took in 1837 up to the Rocky Mountain fur trade gathering areas up the rendezvous up in western Wyoming. So this is an image, and historians think this was a crossing of the Kaw, probably near Lawrence. So it's a big, broad river, and you can see men and equipment being crossing the river there. And as I look at this picture, the words that come to mind are pristine and just beautiful, simple, healthy. Well, not too far downstream from Lawrence, the Kaw flows into Kansas City, as we've seen earlier, and you can see the junction of the Kaw at Kaw Point here. There are several areas of bottomlands that have been very important to the history of Kansas City. This is where a lot of the industry developed, like the West Bottoms, Rosedale Bottoms, Armadale Bottoms, Argentine Bottoms. But the West Bottoms in particular was where the stockyards, Kansas City stockyards, first started developing, and the meatpacking plants. So this area right here. So that leads us to this next image. This was an image taken in 1899, looking down into the West Bottoms, and you can see the Kaw River kind of curving through almost at its junction with the Missouri River. And so you see railroads and stockyards and chimneys and meatpacking plants. This really was an environmental wasteland. Unimaginable amounts of pollution were dumped into the Kaw from the stockyards. They had manure dumps. I think I read that a cow produces 60 pounds of manure a day, and about tens of thousands of cattle, the manure produced, dumped into the river. The slaughter operations from the meatpacking plant, a lot of that was dumped into the river. And then later on, heavy industry developed throughout the bottoms again, because the river was there and you could dump into it. And then residential pollution from Kansas City, both the Missouri side and the Kansas side, ended up into the river. So it's hard to imagine that anything besides just the nastiest of bacteria could have survived here. So environmentally, it was a wasteland, but then also culturally, it was an area of tragedy as well. Thomas Hart Benton, one of America's most famous painters, wasn't born and raised in Kansas City, but he lived for quite a while in Kansas City, and he traveled in pretty rarefied circles as an artist in the Kansas City area. But he also just had a connection with working people, and so he was commissioned to do a mural in the state capital of the state of Missouri, in Jefferson City, Missouri, called The Social History of the State of Missouri. He composed a mural in 35 and 36, and it wraps around a room in the Capitol building, and it's very controversial because it wasn't the sort of propaganda and chamber of commerce type of images you would expect. He portrayed the good, the bad, and the ugly of Missouri's history. And in the section of the mural devoted to Kansas City, which you can see on the right-hand side of this door, he depicted the stockyards. And this is an image taken from the cover of a wonderful book published by the University of Kansas Press about Kansas City in the 30s. But you can see here is a stockyard worker set to bring a hammer down on the head of a cow, and he's stained with blood. Next to what appears to be like a businessman's luncheon. And this fellow right here is Tom Pendergast, who was a kingmaker and political boss in Kansas City, who seems to be presiding over the whole affair. And off in the distance, you can see a line of dancing girls. So Pendergast had really headquartered his vice operations in the West Bottoms as well. And so not only was it an environmental wasteland, but social degradation was a part of the landscape there as well, and connected to that environmental injustice. Okay, well, the punches keep coming. Now we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl, 1930 to 1936, the rough time frame of it. And you can see this map shows the area of the outlines, the contours of the Dust Bowl, where it was most severe. And you can see overall it impacted from Nebraska down into Texas and New Mexico. The most severe wind erosion and the most monstrous dust storms occurred where the corners of Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico met. And certainly a lot of the iconic images from the Dust Bowl days are from this area. But the Dust Bowl did affect really the northern third of the Dust Bowl lies within the extent of the watershed of the Kaw. Here's an image of a dust storm descending on the town of Napanee, Nebraska. One of the very few dust storm images from Nebraska. That was a little town on the Republican River. So the Dust Bowl coincided with a period of severe drought in North America, but it was not the most severe drought that had ever occurred before, or the most severe drought that has ever occurred since. But it also occurred in conjunction with what's called the Great Plow Up. And this was a time in the 1920s when mechanized agriculture really came into its own, and these magnificent tractors and could drag plows through the prairie, and harvesting machines, combines were developed and became available. And unbelievable amounts of the prairie were plowed up. High Plains in particular were plowed up during this time. Wheat prices were good. And people like this guy right here, Simon Fishman, who was called a wheat king, he and his employees, you can see in Tribune, Kansas, in 1925, converting shortgrass prairie to wheat ground. And I tried to learn a little bit more about this guy because this happened throughout the Great Plains, but it was especially pronounced in the western reaches of the Kansas-Kaw River watershed on the High Plains. And I found this man's obituary, which appeared in the New York Times in 1956. Simon Fishman, a Russian immigrant whose plow broke nearly 500,000 acres of virgin soil during his long career as a Kansas wheat farmer. So in case you didn't get that, 500,000 acres, 500,000 acres, this one guy alone of shortgrass prairie went under the plow. So the combination of all this plowed up ground, wheat prices crashing, the drought that was making it impossible to grow a crop here exposed all of this ground to massive wind erosion and resulted in what is today called the Dust Bowl. So really an ecological and environmental and socioeconomic disaster. All right, one last one in the sorrow category here, and that has to do with the Ogallala Aquifer. This is the biggest underground aquifer the biggest aquifer in the United States, sometimes also called the High Plains Aquifer. And you can see in the map on the left, the extent, the gray area is the total extent of the aquifer. And this is water found in the Ogallala Formation. This is water that actually came off the Rocky Mountains millions of years ago and was held by the Ogallala Formation. So it's fossil water. It can't be replenished, or only in certain circumstances is the aquifer replenished as it's drawn down. And so what we've been seeing over the years since this advent of irrigated agriculture in the 1960s in particular, is that the aquifer has been drawn down. And so you can see these areas here where it's been drawn down, in some cases over 150 feet. And in some places, the aquifer no longer has any water in it. And this is a semi-arid climate, so there's not enough rainfall to recharge the aquifer. And so it's making farming impossible in some of these areas it's not as bad in our region that we're thinking about right here, but there's still been significant aquifer drawdown. It has profound impact for irrigated agriculture, which dominates much of the agriculture in the High Plains, particularly allowing farmers to grow corn in what ought to be sand sage prairie country. So that has led to a massive conversion of grassland to cropland. If it's prairie and you can't grow anything on it, then oftentimes the prairie grasses have stayed. But through irrigation, if you can grow corn on it, or maybe even soybeans, then plow up the prairie and put in your irrigation. And so it's led to conversion of huge amounts of grassland to cropland. A huge conservation concern for all different kinds of reasons. But one of them, which is not often realized, is its impact on aquatic communities. So streams that arise on the High Plains, particularly in eastern Colorado, have there's not enough rainfall to support water flow in these streams. So if they carry water throughout the year, it's because of the Ogallala Aquifer. And so the drawdown of the aquifer has led to the elimination of these High Plains fish communities, where you find things like these three plains killifish and orange throat darter and brassy minnow. All right, well, enough of the sad stuff. We're going to move on to the subject of hope. And I do find great hope in some of the things that I've learned and seen over the years that are happening in the country of the Kaw. There are all kinds of people working for conservation and community renewal and restoration and revitalization and all these kinds of words that you might use. I'm focusing on three here that I actually focused on in the book in the last chapter, called Stickers. I interviewed people that are involved with these three organizations: Friends of the Kaw, the Nature Conservancy, Prairie Plains Resource Institute. So here are the characters that appear in the book. Don Buehler with Friends of the Kaw, based out of Lawrence, Kansas. Bill and Jan Whitney with Prairie Plains Resource Institute, based out of Nebraska, and Nathan and Laura Andrews, a family who lives on Fox Ranch Preserve, south of Ray in eastern Colorado. So Friends of the Kaw, their mission is to protect and preserve the Kansas River, and they're focused on that stretch from Junction City to Kansas City. And so they're very involved in hands-on conservation issues. You can see down in the lower left, they've been where they've been extracting tires from the river. They also have been very involved in legislation against dredging of sandbars. Paw has really good structure, habitat structure through its lower reaches, but that's threatened by gravel and sand extraction. And so they've worked with that industry to reduce it, and also have legislation that protects the structural health of the river. Probably what they've done that's been more good than just about anything is that they've gotten people back to the river. They have helped fund and develop boat ramps, access to the river. And so kayaking and canoeing, fishing has grown tremendously because of the work of this group on the main stem of the Kaw. And believe it or not, the Kaw is recovering. So this is a guy, he's holding a 50-pound blue catfish he caught not far from Kaw Point. And there's an event called the All-American Catfish Tournament, which launches out from Kaw Point every year. And so some of the fish have been reestablished. You think about, again, how bad that scene was in the West Bottoms. This is some of the best catfishing in the country. And as you can see in a picture in the lower, that folks are able to enjoy the river again. It's not pristine. It's not without its issues, but it's used for recreation now, which is a tremendous win as far as I'm concerned. So this is a picture of some friends of mine, Bill and Jan Whitney, and it looks like it might be the cover of a rock and roll album from the 70s. This couple founded a very unique organization in 1980 called Prairie Plains Resource Institute. They live in the little town of Aurora, Nebraska, a town of about 4,500 people. They love the prairie. It's a long story, but they got involved in some of the early days of prairie restoration, and they learned how the prairie was composed and how it was damaged and how to put it back together, collecting seed and developing restoration practices. And they have restored tallgrass prairie in 14,800 acres, 22 square miles of prairie in 60 Nebraska counties, all starting from this little organization, just a handful of people, kind of from the hippie days in the 70s, done tremendous work. And so an example of a nonprofit, and you can't get much more grassroots than Prairie Plains, and doing tremendous work, very inspiring work. And lastly, on the subject of hope, we'll talk about Fox Ranch, which is a nature conservancy preserve located in northeastern Colorado, excuse me, Yuma County. And this prairie has a number, or this preserve has a number of important attributes. One is that it has about an 8-mile stretch of the Arickaree River, which is some of the last best high plains river habitat left anywhere in the Great Plains. So that's protected on the preserve. It also has some great stands of sand sage prairie, which is good habitat for greater prairie chickens. But the sand sage prairie also has kept the land, since it's rolling and duny and not really amenable to agricultural development and irrigation, that seems to have kept some of the water in the Arickaree River. And so you have some fishes that occur here that represent the western limits of the distribution of fish in the Great Plains. So that's very cool. But it's managed not by setting it apart as wilderness, but very carefully by grazing. And so the Andrews family runs cattle on this ground, not bison, but cattle, but they do it in very precise ways, dividing the ranch up into paddocks where they roll cattle through for intensive grazing for a period of time and then release it. And that's enabled them to develop very precisely the structure of the prairie and to support grassland birds and its overall conservation. So a young family, they have 3 children. Actually, I think they have 4 now, living on this ranch and preserving it for the benefit of everybody. Well, we're going to wrap up here. We've been talking about biodiversity and human communities and the restoration and revitalization of wild and natural communities. And spend a little bit of final time talking about human communities. And it's no secret that a lot of towns are struggling. A lot of towns in the Great Plains are struggling. There's a great book called The Last Days of the Rain Belt written by David Wishart, professor at the University of Nebraska, and he documents the just series of settlement and collapse that has happened through the Great Plains over the years. He makes the statement that occupying the High Plains has always been a tenuous endeavor from the past even to the present. Corey Brown is a journalist out of Los Angeles. She actually grew up in Wichita, Kansas, but she wrote an article. She traveled around Kansas looking at communities, particularly from the standpoint of food and food deserts, and made this statement. That's the thing about rural Kansas. No one lives there, not anymore. Well, of course, that's not true, but that does kind of capture the prevailing attitude of the East Coast or the West Coast. When people think about the hinterlands, they just think nobody lives there anymore. But in fact, that's not the case. Have you heard of the idea of the Buffalo Commons? This was an idea that came to light in 1987 through an article that was published in a planning journal that was titled Great Plains from Dust to Dust by Frank and Deborah Popper, who they're retired now, but they were professors at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And they wrote in the article that we believe over the next generation, the plains will, as a result of the largest, longest running agricultural and environmental miscalculation in American history, become almost totally depopulated. And the article was subtitled "A Daring Proposal for Dealing with an Inevitable Environmental Disaster." Their recommendation basically was to relocate people out of the towns and villages of the Great Plains and return it to a bison pasture. Well, this was published in a technical journal with relatively small circulation, so it took a little bit of time for it to gain the light of day. But once people who actually lived on the plains started hearing about this, it created a huge uproar. And as you can imagine, calling into question their lives and their livelihoods and their family history. To the Poppers' credit, they actually went on a listening tour after this book came out, or after this paper came out, and traveled around through the Great Plains and visited some of the places they talked about. And their very first stop, believe it or not, was in the country of the Kaw, a town of McCook, Nebraska, in the southwest corner of the state. And the sheriff was anticipating some trouble when they arrived, and so he had some extra deputies on duty. But they spoke in the gymnasium at McCook High School, and no real problems, just some worked up people. So things would fine. And then from McCook, they had a meeting in Denver. They were going to travel to speak to a group in Denver. So they traveled through southwest Nebraska. They, to their credit, they came out here, but they also brought with them a journalist from the New York Times and a photographer. So there seemed to be something about a little hint of, well, we're heading out to the hinterlands to see how those backwater people live. So this image in this magazine article shows them standing atop a bale of hay on their way to Denver. And they're dressed up, they've got their attaché cases, and it seems to me a little bit mocking. But anyway, McCook kind of made some hay of its own out of their visit. They eventually branded their community the capital of the Buffalo Commons. They have a Buffalo Commons storytelling and music festival that they launched. And so they've taken this knock on the Great Plains from the Poppers and made something out of it. And McCook it's a bigger town. It's 7,500 people, but they have a bakery that has been awarded a James Beard Award as one of the premier restaurants in the country, believe it or not, and a modern art gallery. It's kind of a center for hubs and a hub for arts and entrepreneurial. So take that, Poppers. To me, one of the most enjoyable examples of the resiliency of High Plains communities, Great Plains communities, is the game of six-man football, which, and I know I'm bragging again, but it was invented in the country of the Kaw, in the town of Chester, Nebraska, where during the 1930s, there weren't enough boys in town anymore to support a standard 11-man football team because of the Depression. A lot of families were moving out, and then the Dust Bowl. So a teacher at the high school in Chester devised rules for a game of six-man football instead of 11-man, so that these towns could still have football, which is a huge community source of pride and gathering on Friday nights. And the first game debuted in Hebron, Nebraska, September 26, 1934. So I got to witness one of these games a couple of years ago. They're fun. They're very different. The field's different. The rules are different in some ways. Nebraska, it's still played. There are about 20 schools in Nebraska that play six-man football. And there's about 30 some in Colorado that play six-man football. Most of these are towns on the Eastern Plains, and a lot of them are located in the country of the Kaw. This was a photo taken this past November, the semifinals of the six-man football championships between Stratton and Otis, two towns within the watershed of the Kaw. And so, as I understand, there's about 30 schools in Colorado that still play six-man football, and which ranks third after, I think, Texas and Montana. So still a part of the culture and the fabric of these communities, and one of the ways that they are fighting decline. So David Brooks is a columnist with the New York Times, and he made a tour of some places in the Great Plains, including McCook, and wrote an article, What Rural America Has to Teach Us. And I really like this. He says, everybody says rural America is collapsing, but I keep going to places with more moral coherence and social commitment than we have in our booming urban areas. Now, sometimes we feel like we need the New York Times or whatever to endorse our way of life or whatever. We really don't. But I appreciated that he recognized that not everything is turning to dust in the Great Plains. Down below, this book called Flyover Church, you are familiar probably with that title, Flyover Country, that's often applied to the Great Plains. Because people don't want to spend time in it or drive through it, they just soon fly over it. And I read this book just came out last year by a pastor, a Mennonite pastor who has served some churches in Kansas. And he's basically written this book to encourage other pastors in small towns in the Great Plains. And I love this statement, rurality isn't a problem to be solved. Rural is a way of life, a kind of culture. We're still here. One of the places where I've seen this most dramatically played out is in the little town of Hagler, Nebraska, in the southwest corner of the state, right just miles from the Colorado line. And there was a couple, Lenita and Stan Carlock, who grew up in Hagler, went to high school here. They went away and had professional lives in Omaha, Nebraska, traveled the world, collected art, but eventually they returned to Hagler, first because they had aging parents that needed care. Then they just decided to put down roots. And this couple is a human, they're just dynamos. I had a chance to tour around with Lenita actually last fall around town, and they've raised funds for a museum and for a thrift shop, for restaurants, for special events. They've moved a schoolhouse, they've created parks and arboretum, all kinds of things. This couple has really done all that they could to help Hagler survive and thrive. And now they're trying to get other folks on board to carry their legacy on. There's a book, Cities on the Plains, which was written by James Shortridge at the University of Kansas years ago. And as he in the book, he describes some of the attributes that enable communities to survive and thrive through hard times and prosper. But then he also says, in some cases, a visitor gets a sense that a few key people have simply willed their community to continued life. And I've seen this over the years and over my travels throughout the Great Plains. There definitely are towns that are on their last legs, but there are others that are fighting with all they have to survive. And so that's a beautiful part, I think, of the story of the country of the Kaw. Pardon me. These revitalization efforts are not confined to small towns. They're happening also in some of the more urban areas, some of the more distressed urban areas in Kansas City and other towns. So the Argentine district of Kansas City, Kansas it's largely a Latino community. Lots of Latino men came in, Mexican Americans came in the early 1900s to work in the rail yards and stockyards. And so the community is in recent years celebrating this heritage and trying to find ways to build up the community. This wonderful mural, it's about 200 feet long, along a main drive through Argentine, picks the history of the community. And so whether it's starting with arts or with planting trees or developing parks or improving schools, whatever, there's lots of work going on in these communities, as well as economic development. Another one is in North Topeka, which is on kind of the other side of the tracks. It's on the other side of the Kaw from the downtown area, the Capital District. And this is an area that was devastated by a flood in 1951. It's always been industrial, but now it's coming back as an arts and entertainment district. So these places undergo changes kind of like if you can envision a succession in a plant community where you have, but first it's maybe coffee shop or a tattoo parlor or a bookstore comes in, and eventually more businesses and eventually residences come in. So that's happening. And they even have a cool name, Noto, the North Topeka Arts and Entertainment District. So you find this happening in some of the more distressed areas, urban areas in the country of the Kaw, which is very encouraging as well. The most massive and maybe craziest revitalization effort that's going on right now in the region is the restoration of the Rock Island Bridge in the West Bottoms of Kansas City. This is a bridge located not too far from where the Kaw merges with the Missouri at Kaw Point, and historically a railroad bridge working, serving the stockyards and other heavy industry in the area. It was decommissioned in I think 1970s and hasn't been used for a while. But now it is being transformed into a landmark destination bridge, kind of like the High Line in New York City, if you've ever been there. Restaurants, coffee shops, and a place where you can go and have a craft cocktail while you look at sunset over the Kaw River. So that kind of wraps things up. We've looked at affection, astonishment, sorrow, and hope. These are the things that I've thought of as I've looked at this particular landscape. And really, any landscape you might focus on, any watershed, any part of just any place on the face of the earth, you can experience all of these emotions and reactions. And I'm sure you have your places as well that you love. I'm just going to close with this last slide. This is an image of the rainwater basin. And to me, this is kind of emblematic of the resiliency of nature. So you have a highly agricultural landscape where that still has some wetlands. They're not in great shape, but they still support the migration of birds like the Hudsonian godwit, this incredible migration from one end of the earth to the other. And so the resilience of these places and the beauty of them as well just makes them are inspiring and require a deeper look. And oftentimes you don't have that appreciation unless you take a deeper look. One of my favorite writers is Wendell Berry. He's lives in Kentucky, and he's a farmer, but also a poet and essayist, and he's written some wonderful books. He wrote this book called Life is a Miracle. The aim of the book was really kind of a poking back at the sort of the naturalist worldview that dominates a lot of writing about ecology and conservation. He particularly actually was taking aim at E.O. Wilson, the father of biodiversity. But so the title of the book is Life is a Miracle. And he says in it, I see that the life of this place is always emerging beyond expectation or prediction or typicality, that it is unique, given to the world minute by minute, only once, never to be repeated. And then is when I see that this life is a miracle, absolutely worth having, absolutely worth saving. So thank you for the opportunity this morning to talk about this place on the planet that maybe is overlooked by a lot of folks, but hopefully you'll gain a deeper appreciation for it and want to explore a little bit of it for yourself. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I'm looking for questions in the chat. Mostly there's a lot of great praise. Thank you so much for all of your wonderful knowledge. And yes, Joanna, I want to respond about the book. So if anyone is interested in purchasing this book, I'll be in touch after the event, and you can respond to my message and we'll place an order and mail those books out so you can read it yourself. And there is a question. Di Grasky is one of our Southeast chapter chairs, and she's asking, would you be willing to speak about the removal of thousands of Eastern Colorado farm acres to ensure water flow in the Republican River? Should we be thinking and acting to restore native plants on these acres?
Well, yeah, there's this crazy idea, I guess it's been around for a long time, that Nebraska is entitled to some water out of the Republican from Colorado. Um, because we've been having a hard time supplying water out of the Republican River to Kansas. And so there's been lawsuits over the years. And there somewhere, I don't know when, but there was this idea that a pipeline would basically be put in to take water from the South Platte and put it into the Republican watershed so that we would be able to appropriate the whatever amount of water. I'm not up on the specifics of that, but I know in general, that's the concept. It sounds like a horrible idea to me on all kinds of reasons. So I don't, but I believe the governor of Nebraska is pushing for it. I don't know if it's a game of brinkmanship that's going on a little bit. So uh, I don't know. That's deep, deep politics beyond what I like to get involved with, but I am familiar with that. Hopefully it never comes to pass, but if it does, there definitely will be some restoration work that would need to happen.
Thank you. We have some more. Hold on one sec. Debbie mentioned that the Mountain Plover Festival in Carville, Colorado is another example of a rural community creating new opportunities to invigorate the area. So thank you for sharing that, Debbie. Laura also mentioned that. Have you been to the Mountain Plover Fest?
I have not. I've been to Carville, but I've not been this years and years ago.
Mm. All right, so Jean and Polly Reitz are asking, could you touch on the impact of climate change on the ecology and culture of the region?
Not in a very informed way. It's yeah, of course, climate change is impacting everything on a global scale. It's I've been trying to learn more about climate history within this region. And as I said earlier, there have been some droughts that have been far more severe than the drought that brought on the Dust Bowl, both before and after. Some that would be, if they'd happened today, would be devastating to agriculture. And then amazingly, and those of course happened pre-industrial development. Amazingly, there are some floods. There was a flood in 1844 on the Kaw River, which seems to have exceeded any flood that anybody has any record of. That again would seem to be pre-industrial. So all that is to say, this is a part of the world where the climate is extremely volatile. In fact, even during the Dust Bowl days, you had with record drought, you had record cold too, in addition to record high temperatures. So I don't know that the Great Plains is a good place to try and work all of these things out on a global scale because it is such a very volatile environment, and climatologists are continuing to document the history of the region, paleoclimatologists. Um, but certainly on small scale, large scale, anything that can be done to limit the impacts of climate change are going to benefit everybody.
Thanks, Jim. Now, Steve Kiefer is sharing that in 1970, as a Boy Scout, he took a 100-mile plus canoe trip on one of the Blue Rivers, stopping at Tuttle Creek Reservoir. In 1972, they paddled from below there to Lawrence. And he loved your talk, and he wants to know if you have any idea about how the river has changed since then.
Well, first of all, I'm very envious. I would love to have done that myself. I've tried a couple times to join one of the paddle trips and have not been able to for a couple different reasons. But the Friends of the Kaw sponsors paddle trips basically from Junction City all the way down to Kansas City, from where the Blue River that he mentioned comes into the Kaw a little east of Junction City. And so there are a lot of outfitters now all along the river that will support kayaking and canoeing. And there are organized trips for beginners as well as for the more advanced folks. And so my guess is there's far more opportunity, and there's certainly far more places to put in. I think there's like 19 boat ramps for putting into the river through that 173 miles. So I would suggest that he check with Friends of the Caw organization, and because they have information about where you can put in, and they also again sponsor these float trips.
Now, Mike asks, following the Dust Bowl, how has plant diversity recovered or not recovered in Southeast Colorado and Southwest Kansas?
Well, I don't have a good answer to that question. Southeast Colorado, the National Grassland System was established to help take land out of production and as a setting for restoration of those badly wind damaged lands. I've often wondered, where did they get the seed stock that they've used for those massive restoration projects, and how successful was it? Because so much of the natural vegetation was just scoured away. So I'm afraid I just really don't know too much about that.
I will follow up with a note that the Colorado Native Plant Society, in partnership with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, implements the United States Forest Service Region 2 Native Plants Materials Program, in which we collect seed to build a restoration seed bank for the future. And we do collect seed in Comanche. And so we also, I wanted to mention, will be in the area on February 7th and 8th for the Snow Goose Festival. I didn't go that far down in the calendar, but the following weekend on the 7th, we are judging at the science fair at Otero College, and we're tabling at the Snow Goose Festival, and there's lots of cool events. So if you're interested, check that out in the calendar. Phil asks, there is a cultivar, big blue stem, that's called Caw. And have you seen this, or do you have any stories associated?
I'm familiar with the name. It probably was developed at a USDA Plant Materials Center that was located associated with Kansas State University in Manhattan. And they developed a lot of varieties or name varieties of prairie grasses that were made primarily for range improvement, range management. So that would be my guess. That was one of those.
Thank you. I put the Friends of the Caw link in the chat, and you can click on that, kansasriver.org. Those canoe trips sounded awesome.
Yeah, I hope to do one this year.
I've only done one backcountry canoe, and it was down the wild in scenic Missouri, so upstream of what we heard about today. And one question, are you familiar with Dr. Yoshiro Kano at CSU on the native fishes of the Hickory River in Colorado and their competition with the invasive mosquito fish?
I don't know that, Professor. I'm familiar with some studies that were done, in the 90s and all, documenting the fish of the Hickory River and identifying, the important habitat parameters. But I have heard that that's an issue there at the Nature Conservancy Preserve. They're trying to keep out the mosquito minnow or whatever that thing is called. That it's an invasive species that will impact native populations. But so thankfully people are working on that, because that's extremely critical habitat throughout all of the Great Plains, aquatic habitat there on the Hickory River.
I'm just looking this up. I'm putting a link in about the mosquito fish if anyone's interested. All right, folks, thanks for spending your morning with us. We hope to see you soon at another event, and I will process this video, and when I send the video to folks who are registered, I'll also ask you to reply if you would like me to order you a book, and then we'll get those out in the coming weeks. Well, thanks so much.